entire screen? Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Okay, you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I will make it bigger. Just a moment.
Take it easy.
Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Can everyone see?
Yes, good.
All right, let me make sure I don't get any notification. Do not disturb. Okay, good morning. So today I am going to talk about a country that within a single generation went from being one of the poorest nations in the world to a middle income, globally integrated manufacturing hub, and about the question of whether it can take the next leap. So this book is called Vietnam's Economic Leap.
Yes.
Productivity, Innovation, and the Road to High Income Status. So before I talk about the book, I'm just going to quickly discuss the authors. One second. So I don't speak Vietnamese, so I'm not going to try to pronounce their names.
It's okay.
But the first, let me hide this. Let's see. There we go. The first author is, I think the important thing about him is that he spent 35 years at the World Bank, and he was a lead economist there. And he's worked all over the world. So he's worked in Africa, Asia, South America, and the Middle East. So he's not necessarily a scholar. He's not a professor, but he has a lot of experience in the policy world, right? So he's more of a global institutional economist. And then on the other side, we have actually a professor from Vietnam. And so these two authors kind of give you like an insider-outsider perspective. On one hand, we have someone who their work centers around being an economist, and on the other side, we have someone who is a Vietnamese academic. So with that being said, we'll get into the contents of the book. Now, of course, the book is very long, so I tried to find the things in the book that I thought would be useful for those of us who are just listening to the presentation and not actually going to read the book to learn. So obviously I'm not going to go over every detail that's in the book. I just tried to take away the main points that I could. So I think the first thing is like just to start with some of the achievements that Vietnam has made, because they really are incredible. So since they launched their economic reforms in 1986, which is referred to as Doi Moi, I don't speak Vietnamese, but I think basically in English that means renovation or cải cách or whatever, some type of, yeah, basically, reconstruction, renovation. Ever since then, they have achieved a GDP growth of 6.6% a year from 1990 to 2023, which is 2 times the rate of other low-income countries. So the GDP growth has been unbelievable. And then even more unbelievable is that by 2020, less than 1% of the entire Vietnamese population lived in extreme poverty. And the reason that's so incredible is because if you look in 1992, about 50% of the entire population lived in extreme poverty. So, that's incredible to imagine. If you think in 1992, if 50% of Taiwan was living in extreme poverty, and then by 2020, only 1% of the population was living in extreme poverty. So that just gives you an idea of the type of economic growth that the country's had. So credit to their government for being able to pull that off. And then nextly, life expectancy is also a big indicator of economic progress, right? And Vietnam's life expectancy in 2022 was 75 years, which is about as long as the United States. So it is a country, it's amazing to see that there's a country, you know, whose GDP is a fraction of that of the United States, and their life expectancy is already on par with the United States. And if we look at it compared to other similar income level countries, Vietnam's life expectancy is about 12 years higher. And then lastly, you know, why have they been able to pull this off? A major reason is because they've been able to engage in trade at very high levels. So between all of their free trade agreements, they've covered about 87% of the global economy, which makes them the most integrated country in terms of trade in all of Southeast Asia. So what are the foundations of these success? So the authors posit that there's 3 pillars for Vietnam's rise. So the first one is these market reforms, which are known as Doi Moi. And part of these market reforms was something that was signed into law in 1993 called the Land Law Act, which granted households land rights, which then led to farm income rising 60% by 1998. So these pragmatic market-oriented reforms empowered the rural poor, who at the time were the vast majority of the population. So the first pillar we have to remember is the market reforms that the government has undertaken since 1986. It's a bit similar to, you know, China's strategy of reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, kind of following a similar playbook. Now, the next thing is global integration. So in 1995, which is not that long ago, Vietnam joined ASEAN. And then in 2001, Vietnam signed a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. And then in 2007, they joined the World Trade Organizations. So these joining ASEAN, signing a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, joining the WTO, these opened export markets for Vietnam, and they attracted a lot of foreign direct investment, which helped reshape Vietnam's economy from an agrarian one, you know, meaning agriculture, to an export-driven industrial economy. And then, so now we have the 2 pillars of market reforms and then integrating with the global economy. And the last pillar is the transformation of the labor force. So manufacturing and services created about 10 million new jobs in Vietnam from 2010 to 2020, and its wage income share rose from 64% to 70% of household. And so during this time period, the average income nearly tripled in nominal terms, which is pretty incredible. So, you know, it's also very similar to China in the sense that we had a large section of the population transitioning from being rural farmers to going and working in urban manufacturing environments. So you see a lot of parallels between the opening up of Vietnam and the opening up of China. Okay, now all that's great. However, the authors say, you know, beneath the surface, there's a fragile foundation here. So a few numbers, you know, 52% of Vietnam's export growth value is domestically generated. So that's not a lot. If you look at the OECD countries, you know, like Japan, Western Europe, the United States, that number is closer to 90%. So what does that mean? So basically, like Vietnam, they assemble iPhones, but they don't own any of the patents or components that are in the iPhone. So they're putting things together, but they're not necessarily creating things. And then only 18% of Vietnamese firms are linked to global markets, which is down from 35% in 2009. So that's a double-edged sword of FDI. You know, kind of the benefits of globalization are becoming increasingly concentrated in the foreign firms who are doing business in Vietnam. And then lastly, they basically haven't had any total factor productivity growth. So I'll discuss exactly what total factor productivity growth is in a bit for everyone here who's not like working in economy or researching economy all the time. It might be a little bit of a vague term, but essentially Vietnam has been able to grow their economy by adding more workers and capital, not by becoming more efficient. So eventually they're going to run out of more workers and they're going to run out of more capital. And if they're not efficient, then diminishing returns are going to start to show up. So what is the productivity gap? So what is total factor productivity? So if you think of an economy like a factory, you can produce more by hiring more workers, right? Which is labor, okay? Or you can buy more machines, which is capital. But the most powerful growth comes from working smarter, meaning working more efficiently. That's getting more output out of the same input. So that's total factor productivity, right? And as we know, there's three factors of production, right? There's land, capital, and labor. So the thing is that Vietnam, they have a lot of labor, but the supply of labor is limited. So in order to increase their total factor productivity, that labor needs to become more efficient. And so the thing that the authors point out is that their total factor productivity has been negative or stagnant in most periods since 2010 to 2019. So had they even achieved just a very modest level of total factor productivity growth, their GDP per capita could have been 30% higher over the past 2 decades than it was. So this is the major issue that the authors think that Vietnam needs to address if it wants to get out of what is known as the middle income trap. So I think whether or not you study global economics or the economy, the middle income trap is definitely something that is important to understand, especially if you are researching ASEAN or Southeast Asia, because a lot of these countries are dealing with this situation. So how do we visualize the middle income trap? So I like to use an analogy. If you imagine a car is coasting down the hill, coasting meaning you don't need to press on the gas pedal, right? Because you're going down the hill. You can take your foot off the gas pedal and basically just ride the car down the hill without pressing on the gas. Why? Because cheap labor and foreign capital are providing the momentum for you to go down the hill. But eventually, as you start to go down the hill, the road will flatten, meaning that wages will rise and the easy gains from cheap labor and foreign capital will eventually get exhausted. So at that point, you actually need to have an engine in your car so that when you press on the gas, the car can go forward. So what is that engine? That engine is productivity. And the countries that never build that engine, they get stuck. And that's what the middle income trap is, right? So you have rising wages, which means your labor cost advantage starts to erode. So you are no longer the cheapest destination to produce shoes or put together iPhones or make clothes, etc., right? So as soon as you lose that labor cost advantage, foreign firms are going to look elsewhere to manufacture their cheap products. Then you also have a skills mismatch. So basically what that means is what you're learning in school does not match what the modern industry demands, right? So if you need more workers in the semiconductor industry, but all your students are taking East Asian Studies masters, then the skills they're learning in school are not going to match what modern industry is demanding of them. And then, of course, like many countries in Asia and Southeast Asia and around the world, Vietnam has an aging population. And so eventually their workforce is going to start to shrink. And then, of course, we know where Vietnam is located, they're very at risk to climate change and everything that comes with that. And the Gini coefficient in the country has been rising steadily since 2014, which, as we discussed last class, is a measure of inequality in the country. So, inequality can always lead to instability. So when we talk about the middle income trap, the authors said, okay, well, let's take a look and see if we can see how two other Asian countries escaped the middle income trap. And so the authors think that Korea and Taiwan serve as good examples for Vietnam as to how a country can escape the middle income trap. So, basically these countries started at a relatively similar starting point, but they employed very different strategies for getting out of the middle income. So if we first look at FDI, so right now in Vietnam, foreign firms dominate the exports. So domestic firms are not necessarily well integrated into the global economy. But back in the 80s and 90s, Korea and Taiwan, they used FDI to undertake joint ventures. And so because they used joint ventures, the domestic firms in Taiwan and Korea were able to learn, and they absorbed the technology from these foreign firms, which made them more competitive. Next is about export value add. Now, I briefly discussed this earlier. So out of Vietnam's exports, only 52% of them are domestic content. So essentially, they are assembling imported components. So for example, a bunch of pieces that are used to make a, I don't know, Nintendo Switch are put together. Maybe not a Nintendo Switch. That's not a good example. Let's see. Let's say like some tools that you use to build a house, right? A lot of these parts for the tools will maybe be assembled in China or built in China, and then they are shipped to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese take all these parts that are imported from China and then put the tool together, but they're not actually building the tool themselves. Whereas in Korea and Taiwan, these countries progressively built domestic supply chains and their own intellectual property. Nextly is innovation. So the authors argue that, Vietnam has essentially been a passive recipient of foreign technology, whereas Korea and Taiwan, they adapted and they made incremental advances in their technology, which eventually led through the breakthrough innovations that we all know about and see today, whether it's Samsung or TSMC or any of these other major tech conglomerates that are in these countries. Next is their domestic firms, right? So most of the domestic firms in Vietnam are very, 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 very small. And they're fragmented, which doesn't allow them to integrate into the global value chain. Where in Taiwan, that's the opposite, right? In Korea and Taiwan, these countries were these domestic firms were eventually able to establish global reach. So what is the outcome of this? Basically, Vietnam's strategy has left it stuck in final assembly, which has limited spillovers, which spillovers are this concept that's related to neo-functionalism and functionalism, that the more integration you have, these technologies are eventually going to spill over to the domestic firms. But Vietnam has not been able to effectively integrate because they've basically been passive recipients of intermediate goods, and then they're putting those intermediate goods together. However, Korea and Taiwan were able to escape the middle income trap, and both are now high income countries. So I think the reason that the author uses Korea and Taiwan is because these countries are relatively similar in size. They're also East Asian countries, and they have a relatively similar size of population. I mean, of course, not exact, but I think Korea and Taiwan are very good examples for Vietnam to follow if they want to try to escape the middle income trap. So what are the headwinds that are keeping Vietnam from escaping the middle income trap that are out of their control, right? We talked about what's going on in Vietnam, but what's going on in the world that is also making this difficult. So, of course, we have rising protectionism, right? The U.S.-China trade war and economic nationalism are continuing to dismantle the open market. And, Vietnam's export growth has depended on this open market. So we see examples of the United States, the CHIPS Act that was signed under Biden. And then, of course, we've discussed Made in China 2025. these all signal a shift toward these countries prioritizing national resilience and protectionism over the efficiency of their supply chains. Next is the narrowing policy space. So whether it's because of the debt burdens post-COVID or higher global interest rates, which we are still seeing today, or a fiscal strain limit, they all limit Vietnam's ability to invest in the transformation it needs, precisely when those investments are most urgent, right? And so this is a thing that the United States raising interest rates has a lasting impact on the global economy, because if United States interest rates go up, global investors will say, oh, well, I can just put my money in a bond in the United States and I'm guaranteed to make 6%. Why would I take my money and invest in a high risk market like Vietnam when I can get a guaranteed return in the United States of 6%? So this situation with high interest rates is not going anywhere, because we're continuing to see inflation levels in the United States stay elevated, and with the war in Iran, it doesn't seem like they're coming down anytime soon. So I think this issue regarding high global interest rates is going to continue to be a real headwind for not just Vietnam, but for all the countries in the global south. And then lastly, there's the headwind of automation and reshoring, right? So the window for labor-intensive export-led industrialization is closing. Manufacturing is becoming capital and skill-intensive, reducing its capacity to absorb workers leaving agriculture. So what does this mean? Basically, if you opened a factory in 1990, maybe you needed 500 workers or 1,000 workers to run the factory. But now if you open that same factory in 2026, maybe you only need 15 or 20 workers to run the entire factory because of automation. So of course, it's going to have a huge impact on the labor force. And so if there's less manufacturing jobs available for workers in Vietnam because of automation, it's going to have a negative knock-on effect on their economy. Okay, so we've kind of set the stage for what's going on. And so I broke the presentation into two parts. And the second part of the presentation is basically, okay, so what is the path forward for Vietnam? And how do they go from input-led growth to productivity, innovation, and human capital? Okay, so the authors identify something called the 3I strategy. And this is from the World Bank. And the idea is to move from 1I, which is investment only, to 3I, which stands for invest, infuse, and innovate. So investment, what does investment look like? Essentially smart, targeted capital, which means try to continue attracting FDI, but pivot toward high-tech and knowledge-sensitive sectors. Strengthen macroeconomic stability and fiscal prudence to sustain the investment climate, right? So we cannot just be blindly throwing money at things. We need to really take the time to decide what industries are going to be key for the growth of our economy in the future, not just right now. The next is infusion. So infusion basically means technology absorption, right? I think this is something Taiwan and Korea did very well. So moving from passively hosting foreign firms to actively absorbing their technology. Deeper foreign local firm linkages, support for domestic supplier development, and stronger spillover mechanisms. And then the last is innovation, endogenous capability, which basically just means internal capability, right? There's exogenous and endogenous. Endogenous is internal. So for middle income countries, innovation means adapting and improving technologies for local needs, not just frontier R&D. So incremental problem solving, as Korea and Taiwan have demonstrated. So we have investment, we have infusion, and then we have innovation. So let's look at the first pillar of investment. So how do we build domestic firms, right? This is one of the keys to escaping the middle income trap. So what's the problem? Most of the Vietnamese firms, the local firms, are micro enterprises, which means very, very, very small companies. I think I read in the book something like the average domestic Vietnamese company only has 4 employees. So just throughout the economy, any kind of domestic firms are very, 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 very small. And you can feel that when you go to Vietnam. And so basically they're serving local markets. So they don't have much of a capacity for innovation or for exports. And as I discussed earlier, the number of domestic firms in Vietnam linked to global markets continues to fall. And foreign firms are dominating the high value exports, which is leading to weak spillover with local suppliers. So what can Vietnam try to do to fix this problem? So the authors say that Vietnam should pivot its FDI attraction toward high-tech sectors with stronger domestic linkage requirements. Meaning that what they mean by domestic linkage requirements is that if you want to do FDI in our country, you have to give more information to our domestic firms, whether that means training employees, whether that means sharing relatively sensitive technological information, etc., so that these domestic firms in Vietnam can learn and then they can grow themselves. The second thing is to support supplier development programs, linking local small and medium-sized enterprises to multinationals. The third is to broaden access to finance, infrastructure, and skills for domestic firms. And that's easier said than done, right? Because we don't know exactly what the Vietnamese government's budget situation is. And, as we see, they're in a tricky spot because they're constantly balancing between the United States and China. And if they're going to continue to spend more and more and more on their military, it's only going to leave so much access to, for finance for some of these domestic firms. And then, of course, the fourth thing is just reducing the barriers for micro enterprises to formalize and scale. Basically meaning like some of the bureaucracy in Vietnam makes it tough for these small enterprises to grow. And then the last thing is to strengthen small and medium large enterprises linkages in the domestic value chain. Okay, pillar number 2 is regarding the innovation policy. So essentially, we want to be able to adapt technology, not just import it. So for a middle income country, innovation is not just about Nobel Prizes or Silicon Valley startups. It's more about learning how to absorb technology, adapting it to local conditions, and incrementally improving products and processes. So this is what Korea and Taiwan have done very, 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 very well. So the first thing is, right, you need to adopt the technology, meaning you need to import it and use existing global technologies in production. So that's the first step. The next thing you do after you adopt it is to adapt it. So what does that mean? You need to modify this technology to actually fit the local conditions and costs on the ground. Because Vietnam's economy does not look like Italy's economy, right? Or it does not look like America's economy. So once it adopts technologies that are being used in America, it needs to adapt them to fit what's actually going on in their own country. So after you've adopted the technology and then you've adapted it, what you need to do is diffuse it. And diffuse means to spread, right? So essentially, we want to be able to spread our adaptions across the country so that all our different corporations, all our different domestic firms and citizens can use the technology. And then the last thing is, after you've diffused it, you need to constantly continue to upgrade the technology, right? So once you diffuse it, you can't just say, "Oh, okay, well, we've diffused it. That's enough." It needs to constantly be upgraded and improved, just like infrastructure or anything else. You cannot just build a road and then say, "Oh, okay, we built the road. It's done." No, you have to continue to maintain it, right? Or even improve it. Okay, Now, the last pillar is number 3, which to me is the most important one because none of these economies are anything without humans, right? Human capital is essential. So how do we fix the human capital issue? So the first thing is labor market reform. Vietnam's economy is highly informal. I'm sure anyone who has been there understands that. And there's actually a relatively high level of unemployment among young college graduates because the skills they have do not match what the market actually needs. So the author said, like, for example, a lot of young Vietnamese students are studying social sciences compared to how many are studying hard sciences. And so that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that there's only so many jobs that are related to social science. And right now there's a much higher demand for jobs that are related to hard science. So when you have so many students who are graduating with social science degrees, when there's only a limited number of jobs that can employ those people, it leads to a skill mismatch in the economy. Second is reverse migration, right? So what does that mean? Basically, that means how do we get really, really talented people who are Vietnamese who have left back to Vietnam? And one of the things authors mention is what Taiwan has done in Hsinchu, right? Like, for example, TSMC and these different companies have actually been able to get a lot of very talented Taiwanese people who left Taiwan to go to the United States or to go to Europe to actually come back to Taiwan and work and bring some of their most talented people back to the country. Now, the third thing is education. So Vietnam actually has a pretty good education system, but they're facing 2 main problems. One, which I have already discussed, is that they don't have enough STEM students, but which is basically the hard sciences, science, technology, math, etc. The other thing is that they're having a teacher shortage, and this is especially true in some of the rural populations. And I mean, I think Vietnam is not the only country that's experiencing the issue of a teacher shortage. I know Taiwan does not, though they don't only have a 少子化 problem, but there's also not very many teachers, right? From what I understand, sometimes it's difficult for some of these elementary and high schools to get quality teachers, especially when you get outside of Taipei. So this, again, is not a problem that is unique to Vietnam. And then lastly is aging and female labor, right? So Vietnam, they reached an age population. They will reach an age population status by 2036. Simultaneously, female labor force participation, already high, must be sustained via childcare, pay equity, and career pathways. So again, I mean, some of these challenges that Vietnam is facing are not unique to Vietnam, right? Taiwan also has a very high female labor force participation. And so the government is constantly trying to figure out, how can we provide subsidies? How can we figure out a way to make childcare more affordable for parents so that women can continue to work and keep our economy going? Okay, so lastly, the authors think that Vietnam can reach high income status by 2045. However, it's not inevitable. So what are Vietnam's strengths, right? They do currently have a very young population. It's also highly educated, especially when you look at its education level compared to its GDP. As we've discussed throughout the semester, Vietnam is located, in a very strategic location. It's proven that it has the ability to undertake reforms and grow its economy very, very quickly. So that means the government is capable. They also have very extensive free trade agreements, and they have a strong poverty reduction track record, right? So there's a lot of strengths with Vietnam. But what's the core challenge? basically they need to figure out how to shift from factor accumulation to productivity driven growth, meaning becoming more efficient. So they have to build domestic firms that can learn, adapt, and innovate, not just assemble products. So what's the window here? So the era of national rise reform that was signed in 2025 aligns with a lot of the policy prescriptions that are outlined in this book. However, the demographic and climate clocks are still ticking. So the time for Vietnam to act is now. And at the end of the book, the author said, Vietnam stands at a historic crossroads where past successes provide the confidence, but not the guidance for the future. So they're moving into uncharted territory. And that is my presentation.
It's very great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
We have give us very high level, maybe factory level presentation. I think it's very, very well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. And yes, good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You pay more attention to discuss Vietnam economy. How about actually, I want to, especially when you come from, you are an American. How about as an American to look the Vietnam success or Vietnam economic development, especially as you know, when we talk about Vietnam War, 1970s.
Yeah.
And Vietnamese, our Vietnamese friends call this war is U.S. war.
Yeah.
So actually, this is my personal question. I want to let you to share what's your really deep opinion about the development of Vietnam for this moment as a communist party state, and they have a good economic development.
Yeah.
And what's your feeling toward Vietnam for this moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think I mentioned a couple times during the presentation that researching Vietnam, you can see a lot of parallels with China.
Yes.
You know, of course, they are both one-party states, right?
Yes.
And they're also both, on the surface, communist states. However, they are both increasingly only communism in name and not necessarily in practice, right? They are definitely a blend of socialism and capitalism. And so this is something that I always think about, you know, like whether it's Vietnam or China, have these economies grown because of their government or in spite of their government? Sometimes I think the government will take credit for the economic success, but oftentimes it is just the government getting out of the way of the people. And so to me, none of this happens without people. So while it's very easy to say, oh, the Vietnamese government has done a great job, to me, it's the Vietnamese people who have done a great job.
Yes.
And you know, you see this in Taiwan. You know, Taiwan at one point was a one-party state, right? But it became a democracy, and its economic growth has not slowed down because it became a democracy. Its economic growth has only increased. So there is a causation and correlation. Like, yes, Vietnamese economy has grown, and yes, it is an authoritarian communist state. But is that why its economy has grown? That I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but you know, I'm obviously super optimistic of what Vietnam can do, but it's because of the people, not because of the government.
Yes.
Is what I would say. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
How about William? Do you have any question? Or anyone?
You hear me?
Or maybe you can from the U.S. Navy position. How about your Navy link to the Vietnam, any military department?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Honestly, we don't really have that many ties to like Vietnam just because of like our history, like, for the first reason. And then two, kind of like espionage reasons. We don't really have like cooperations with Vietnam's Navy, which is a shame because I do feel like they could be like a good ally against China. And honestly, like every person at my school who's like of Vietnamese descent, they have like a really strong love for like the U.S. and I don't know, like our current like acting Secretary of the Navy, he's actually a South Vietnamese refugee from like the 70s. He was like evacuated on one of the helicopters and he was like 6 years old. So I feel like we do have like those like cultural ties in the Navy to Vietnam. And now with like the South China Sea, it's really important that Vietnam, they don't necessarily have to be our ally, but they could be like a strong partner working against China. And especially they have their own claims in the South China Sea. We work a lot with like the Philippines and Thailand and a little bit with like Singapore and Indonesia, but like not so much with Vietnam. But it's interesting. I feel like we're gonna have to, especially as like China builds these like artificial islands. It's definitely gonna be inevitable.
Mhm. Thank you. Do you have any question to ask Wei Hao?
Sorry, I was like a little bit late. I thought it would start at 9:20, but it's all good. I really like the presentation. I'm just trying to think of a question.
Okay. Youzong, do you have any question?
Because this is kind of like this is all new to me. I'm not very familiar with this kind of field. So, I don't think I have any questions, but yeah. So, but I do have a curious, like we I think like it's something that related to Taiwan, because since as we all know, that a lot of Taiwanese company have gradually moved out from China to the Southeast Asia part, especially in Vietnam. So I was wondering how, like, first, why Vietnam? If we are talking about the human resource or the cheap labor,
Yes.
there are a lot of different options, but why Vietnam? So we escaped from China because of its, we can say because of its political problem. Then why we choose another communism party country to become a new place for our like factory or something like that? So that is kind of my curious, but maybe it's not really directly related to William's presentation, but that is something like whenever we talk about Vietnam's economics, that will be my questions.
Okay.
I think that it again is related to the people. Like I think like a lot of Taiwanese business people, they don't necessarily care about politics.
Yes.
And they want to go where they can get their product made for the lowest price and the highest quality. And so while there is certainly countries in Southeast Asia that have lower labor costs than Vietnam, right now, I think that most people say that if you want to find the best balance between quality and price, Vietnam is the place to go, because the people there are really incredibly hardworking. And not to say people in other countries aren't hardworking, but I think you would find if you go to Laos or if you go to Bangladesh, or if you go to Nepal, any of these countries who are also in this lower income level, the quality of work you're going to get is not going to be as high as you're going to get in Vietnam. And so I think the labor cost is somewhat negligible. And so I think that would be my opinion as why these Taiwanese business people are continuing to go to Vietnam. But that's just my opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good. And as you know, everyone know, when we talk about, we mentioned last week, we mentioned Confucius.
Yeah, exactly.
We always to describe Japan, Korea, no matter North Korea and South Korea, China, Taiwan, even Singapore and Vietnam is so-called Confucius cultural circle, which means we work hard and we study hard because Confucius teaches us we have to do that. Because we are a human being. As a human being, we have to work hard and study hard. So our Taiwanese businessmen, we have something noise at our school. So Taiwanese businessmen want to be something virtual similar society to recruit those workers to do their job. So this is one main reason we have shared some. As you know, June 19, we called the Drum Bowl Festival. We eat the rice ball, 粽子. Actually, Vietnamese also eat those 粽子. And you can to visit many sightseeing in Vietnam. They also have some Mandarin. Also the so-called traditional Mandarin in their building. But the young Vietnamese can not recognize those Mandarin. But if I to visit those places, I can recognize the different those Chinese characters. But the Vietnamese cannot recognize because this is Chinese culture. Because Vietnam belonging China 1,000 years. So they will describe their history. They called belonging North 1,000 years. They don't want to recognize they belonging to China. So they describe they belonging North 1,000 years. This is why so many Chinese people, even Chinese businessmen and the Taiwan businessmen will visit to Vietnam because they have something similar culture. Work hard and study hard, and they want make more money for to improve their life. So this is the main reason, in my opinion. So
I agree.
yes,
I remember when I was taking macroeconomics a long time ago, we discussed something that's called like the gravity model. And the idea is like countries who are close to each other will trade more with each other, and countries who are very big will trade more with each other. And the gravity model is mostly used as a way to find trade relationships that maybe will surprise you. And so, for example, the United States and Ireland will trade a lot with each other, even though Ireland is a pretty small economy and the United States is a very big economy, and they are not very close to each other. And the reason is because there is a lot of cultural similarity. Yeah, so it makes sense.
yes, and As you know, South Korea and Taiwan, we can development dependent on United States. And Vietnam also want to change their economy from the agriculture to industry society. Of course, Vietnam want to dependent on Soviet Union. And as you know, actually, I write my book. My book, as mentioned, when Vietnamese ask, yes, Soviet and Russia to help them to develop their economy from the agriculture to industrialization. As you know, the Russian refuse because Russia have their own problem. So Vietnam have to make their own road. Their own road is the reform and openness. So reform and openness from the 1986. From 1986, Vietnam always to sign and to create any chance for their economic growth. Actually, my Vietnamese friend also to let me know, actually, Vietnam want to join the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. They want to copy Taiwan model to join the APEC. This is a very important Vietnam's path to join the economic framework. But as everyone knows, actually, in this moment, Vietnam as a member of ASEAN, Vietnam as a member ASEP, Vietnam as a member of CPTPP, actually, Vietnam is our teacher, Taiwanese teacher, because Vietnam to sign many free trade agreements, even with the Russia sponsor. As you know, Europe have the EU. Actually, Europe also have a European Asian community sponsored by the Russia. Vietnam also joined this community. So Vietnam have the many different type of FTA. So we always to describe Vietnam as a bamboo democracy. They can get the Western resources. They also can get the Eastern resources. This is Vietnam. Okay. So do you have any other question about awareness?
I got one.
Okay.
So did the book talk at all? Like, so I'm doing the Philippines for my like presentation, and one of the big problems with the Philippines is like, it's like not the problem that like, oh, like their education's lacking. Like a big problem in the Philippines is corruption and how like the elite continues to like basically run the country. Like right now, the leader of the Philippines is like Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who's like the son of
Yes.
one of the Philippines like brutal dictators. So did the book, your like Vietnam book, did it talk at all about like corruption in Vietnam and how it's trying to like solve it?
Let me go. I mean, they talked about like that there's been anti-corruption campaigns and that, you know, combating corruption would significantly improve the business environment. But I didn't feel like it was like a big enough part of the book that like I wanted to include it in my presentation, I would say. They didn't like go like too in depth. Like they just like broadly spoke about like enhancing anti-corruption efforts or taking, you know, anti-corruption initiatives or anti-corruption campaigns or combating corruption, but they didn't really go into like any specific forms of corruption in the book. They just kind of broadly talked about that continuing to combat corruption is an important part of growing the economy, but they didn't like go into like some case about corruption or anything like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
Yes.
partly because it's a communist country too. So I think even the authors, even though they are not in Vietnam, like they're still of Vietnamese descent, like I think they are a bit careful to too openly criticize government officials. Like even in China, when they talk about anti-corruption stuff, they talk about it very broadly. They will not always like talk about the specifics of cases and what actually happened.
Yes, this is good question. Actually, I know very detailed about the corruption in Vietnam, but it's time limit. Maybe next week I can share something about the detail of Vietnam's corruption. It's very serious, actually, for even today. It's very serious. No matter we study at the university, even we study at university, even we do any business, we have to give some Chinese 红包 to any different labels. So this is very complex. Okay, it's a good question. Okay, who will be the next one? Thank you, Terence.
Okay, so I can go next.
Okay.
Okay. So, let's see. Okay. So can anyone see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I see.
Okay, so the book I choose is called Singapore I Recognize, and because it's not really like a textbook, to me it's more like a here is the book. So this book is more like a memoir and a series of a very severe social journalist. So the author is Kristen Hunt. She is an independent journalist and social activist in Singapore, and she has constantly published a lot of contents and papers in the international media or in a journalist platform, which she also founded. It's called New Naratif. It's Malaysian. So this book has include a lot of article that is written by her with her very with her observations in the Singapore society for about 10 years, about longer than 10 years, and try to reveal the narratives made by the state and the single story of the Singapore story, and to make the international society to see more complex and more and different kind of story within this kind of under the Singapore myth. Okay, so so this is the why the purpose for her to write this book. So in Singapore is a country that we all know is very good at political propaganda to shape their international image and to make people believe they are all good. But to Kristen, who is a Singaporean and who has lived in Singapore for a very long time, in her life she can sort a lot of different stories, a lot of different things that is not very like the story told by the nation. So the book is trying to reveal this kind of delusions to make people see something like the hidden mechanics or different kind of voice or the systemic frictions beneath the state narrative. Okay, so the tale of so to her, Singapore is like living in Singapore is like looking at two different kind of stories. From the nation, the Singapore story is very efficient, very wealthy, very harmonized, and very democratic. That is the story that the Singapore government wants the international society to see, and those words are kind of like the key point or the keyword that the Singapore government wish whenever talk about Singapore, the society to think about. But in the reality, or to, at least to Christians, there are different layers of story that should be seen and should be taught, because we see in the Singapore society, we can see a lot of different we can see the discrepancy between the wealthy citizens and the poor citizen, and those are the state citizen and those are the migrant workers, and the problem between the majority of Chinese and the ethnic minorities. And we also see the state power to fight against the civic dissent. So in this book, she used a lot of different stories, or at least the interview experience that she had, to try to tell a different story, that a story that is very different from the Singapore story. And I will not talk about the whole books. I will only choose some material, some story that is maybe more relative to our class, because they have a lot. Reading this book is like reading a lot of different kind of interview story, and you can see a lot of things that maybe the Singapore government don't want you to see. And yes, so okay, so the problem of the Singapore government, or the things like, to me, that is more scary, it's like Singapore didn't use the way that when we talk about the so Singapore don't like Chinese government. They use another way to hide their tendency of control the social speak, or their authorities. So to Kristen Han, this is like the boiling frog. That is kind of a sentence we use in Mandarins. We say 温水煮青蛙. You use a not really hot water to cook a frog, and since the frog is not very sensitive about the temperature, so if you rise the temperature very gently, they don't know they are cooked. So that is something the Singapore government used to control their people. So traditionally, autocracy will be like bloodshed and violence, or something very like the extrajudicial detentions of journalists, something like that. But in Singapore, they don't ban you on talking about what you want to say, but they use different kind of things to make you feel that there is some topic that you shouldn't talk about. So in the Singapore model, like, you are relatively legal attritions, or something like sweeping contempt of court charge, or crippling defamation suits, or total financial exhaustions. So these things, to a democratic country, they don't think this is a problem, because this is very legal. Or they can even say, the Singapore government can even say that we allow you to say these things, but you will be sued. And even if you're being sued, they have a high possibility that you will not become a criminal, or you will not go to a prison. Yet the processing is very exhausting. So to to most of the civics, they will not want to get involved with this kind of things. So they use this kind of delusions to make you feel like we have a freedom of speech. Yet in the reality, you are still controlled, and you will come up something that is called self-censorship before you say anything. So that is how Singapore's government to control their country. So this is the model of the architecture of fears. So civic action so the state really needs to actively censor its citizens. So because by using the highly ambiguous laws for citizens to internalize control, creating a continuous self-censorship, the self-censorship to their citizens. So there's a story in this book. She said, one time she was invited to a school to make some kind of a civil education guest teacher. So they want to in that lessons they want to make the student to do some critical thinking about their society or something about the political problem. But when they propose to the school board about what they are going to talk about, the school teacher immediately say they can't do that. So in Singapore's education, or to most of Singaporean, when there is a social issue or a political problem, they don't think. They will tend to think about how to fix the problem instead of why there is a problem. So that is something very interesting to me, because when they are called very efficient nations, to us, if there is a problem, we will naturally think about why there is a problem. So as long as we end the origin of the problem, they will not have any more problem in the future. Yet to the Singaporean, they don't think about the origin of the problem, because normally the origin of the problem is PAP, and they are not allowed to criticize the PAP. So they will only to think about how can we do about the problem instead of fix the problem forever. So that is how the PAP government using this kind of system to make the people to make the people fear about criticizing PAP and become So I think and to make the Singaporean don't want to like criticize on PAP's actions and only talk about what they can do to fix the problems. Okay, so there are also a lot of illusions that the Singaporean government made to block the dialogue. So the Public Consultation Act as a managed extractions channels, the state only the state is like a black box. So there are a lot of information come into the black box. For example, the citizens' feedback, the public consultations, the town hall. So the government know what is going on, but they only choose the information that they want you to see, and they want to reveal to the public, and they will hide a lot of national data, national history, national informations, and pretending they don't know these kind of things. So the citizens will believe what the government say is true, and because they do the research, they have the data, but actually those data are selected. So this is how they control the awareness to the information they want the citizens to know, to maintain their image as a very justice, a very efficient government. Okay, so, and also they have a very weird or a very strict law of illegal assembly. So normally when we like in Taiwan, if you only have one people, it is hard to tell. It is hard to be sued as a illegal assembly since you only have one people, one person. Yet in Singapore, even if there are only one citizen or protesting, you can still be called or be or be accused as a illegal assembly. So that is a very strict in this kind of law or in this kind of system, they will make people afraid of saying things because whenever there is a protest, you will always need to have one starter, and with that one starter, you can get more and more people to care about this issue and make change possible. But in Singapore, there will no one willing to be the first citizen to call for the differences. And that is also very interesting because if you have ever searched or curious about the freedom of speech in Singapore and you googled on the website, you will see they have a so-called corner or a speaker's corner in the Hong Lim Park, and they are very proud of this corner because they say this is the representation of the symbol of the freedom of Singapore, because in this corner you can speak whatever you want. That is how the government say. But in the reality, the speaker corner is the only place in Singapore you can protest. Outside that corner is not really big. It's only like I think it is only like 3 meters square or something, like not very big. It's just a tiny corner in a huge park, and that is the only place you can protest. Outside that place, any protection is illegal assembly. And what's more, it's not everyone can protest in that corner. If you want to make some argument or you want to make a speak, first you need to register in to the government and to say what are you going to say. So that's very weird. So if you are going to protest, sometimes in most of time, it is that you are not happy with something that the government did. But if you want to argue with that, you still need to register. You need to be approved to make the complaint, or you need to be approved to make to criticize the government. So that's very obvious. Those complaint or those arguments are not really important, or it will not hurt the government's the right of ruling. So I think what Speaker's Corner is kind of a great example to talk about the delusion that the Singaporean government made to make you believe they have the freedom of speaking. Okay, so and there is the ultimate red line in Singapore's government. So like the Transformative Justice Collective is a civil group, is a NGO, NGOs. They try to reveal a lot of historical documents in Singapore, like for example the 1963 operation of Coastal or the 1987 operation Spectrum. This kind of things that might do a severe effect to the PAP's ruling, the right of ruling in Singapore. So these kind of things, which the ultimate red line is something that will make PAP's government lose their right to rule Singapore, or to make PAP become kind of evil in Singaporean history. So that is the ultimate red line. Yeah. And whenever you touch the ultimate red line, there will be Singapore government don't really like using the legal procedure to make you be accused or to make you become some kind of a criminal. They use different kind of things. So they use state media, they use official statement, they use internet troll to put a lot of label on you to make you become kind of a national traitor or a threat to order, or you are controlled by the foreign agents, something like that, to make you become you are not doing this for the Singaporean to make Singapore better. You are doing this because you are controlled by the foreign who want to make chaos within Singapore. To make it so you are controlled by, so you don't love your country. You don't want to make the reason why you say this, or the reason of your behavior is to want to make chaos in Singapore, and you betrayed your country. You are a racist, something like that. Those are the label or the tag that will be put if you touch the ultimate red light. So to other countries, or to the democratic nations, they normally this kind of behavior because Singapore because this is not like China, they directly ban you on speaking that, or they use kind of a legal procedure to legal method to to make you become a prisoner, or they only allowed you to they only allow the national or the official press media to speak to announce something that related to the government's policy. They still in Singapore, you are still free to talk. You can still write an article. You can still publish a book. You can still do a lot of things. Yet there is a consequence. So the consequence is be tagged by the government. So with that kind of tag, and that tag is not just like a random people say that you are a national traitor. It's the government telling the whole Singapore society that you are a national traitor. So that kind of pressures make Singaporean citizens are not willing to criticize the government or to say something that the government may not willing to hear. So to be honest, there's still a censorship, but by using with a very democratic delusion or democratic outfit to pretending they don't have a censorship. Okay, but it doesn't mean they don't have hope in Singapore. So in the recent year, we have seen some tiny breakthrough, or there are some issue. They are gentle. They are gradually become acceptable in Singapore. So the first is the pink dog. So in the past, or even now, the LGBTQ equality are being ignored by the Singaporean government. But starting from the 2012, the pink dog is kind of it's a little bit like a Singapore version of Pride Month. So every year they will have a gathering in the speaker's corner and to try to promote for the LGBTQ plus equality and the community visibility against the traditionalist resistance. So this can be seen as a kind of a breakthrough to fight against the traditional taboo in Singapore. And another one is the transitional justice, but to carry to the author, she thinks that Singapore has already started to do the transitional justice, but to me that is a joke, because even though they have followed the international tendency to start to highlighting the transparenting on the National Archive. So they have founded a National Archive library, yet that library is within a military camps. So whoever want to visit that library, you need to be approved by the military, and you will be, before you enter the library, you will be searched by the military. So basically, yes, there is a National Archive library. Yes, you can read the National Archive, but who can read the National Archive, and what are you going to use the National Archive are still be selected and be controlled by the government. So that is how Singapore do, and that is something, that is how Singapore, like by doing half of the freedom, or half, like, yeah, they only allowed part of people to use, or to become to access to those kind of document, and they can tell the international society that we allow people to do that. But in the reality, only part of the people can do that. So to the author, they the reason she wrote this book is not to, is she doesn't want to totally overtake the national narrative. Instead, she want to let the international society realize that there is not only single Singapore story. So they can have, Singapore is not a country as the government say. So beside that kind of narrative, there are still a lot of different kind of story or different kind of point of view can be seen in when we talk about Singapore. So that is, so this book have used a lot of point of view or a lot of story that is more like a button-up narrative to make people see the reality and something behind the national narrative. Okay, so to her, this is kind of a new metric for change. So they can expand in the boundaries of society, societal imaginations, and removing internal limitation on creativity and planting seeds for the next generation of social society. So yeah, okay. So that is for my book.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yozong. Give us a great presentation. Great.
Thank you.
We talk about the maybe the divided world of Singapore.
Yes.
That's the same word.
Uh.
Okay, it's good. So, do you have any question about? We turn back to our first topic, Singapore.
Yeah.
Especially from a journalist, all right? From journalist, maybe journalist memory.
Yeah.
When she stay at Singapore, how many years?
She still stayed in Singapore. She says Singapore.
She stay here, stay
Yes.
there. Okay. Okay. She write this way, maybe have some problem.
Yes, but I think because she are still in Singapore, only make this story or only make this book more convincing, because she can become a great example for how to what she called that Singapore government make a huge delusion of having freedom of speech or freedom of speech.
Yes.
Because she can write about this kind of book, but she still face a lot of problem when she stay in Singapore. She has been constantly sued by the government. Even she never been become a prisoner, but she need to go to the court. She need to deal with a lot of government's paper, to explain why are she talking about this, or why she need to do that. So she can become a great example of how Singapore use this kind of system to control the thinking or the speaking of their citizens.
So let me ask her another question. How many years you stay at Singapore, Yozong? How many
Me?
years? Yes,
I have stayed in Singapore for total about 2 years.
total 2 years.
Yes.
Okay. How about your personal feeling and this other's feeling? Do you have any gap or any different or any the same side about your personal feeling and the other writing?
To me,
Yes.
because my research field is art history, so
Yes.
to me, I can see that because Singapore want to build a national brand as the center of art in Southeast Asia.
Yes.
So sometimes they need to allow some kind of artwork that might against their point of view or the government's thought. So they will so whenever there's artists like want to, let's say, do a artwork that may be related to the LGBTQ equality,
Yes.
to the government, that is something against to their traditional point of view. So when you apply for a national funding to help you do this artwork, you will be rejected. But on the other hand, as long as you be rejected by the national funding, the Temasek Foundation will give you money. But everyone knows that Temasek Founding is held by the government.
Yes.
Even though it looks like a private company. So that is how Singapore do things. They always like a double face spike. So they turn you down in one hand, and they will allow you to do that by using another way. And another gap or another shock is like when I visit the National Archive Library. Like in Taiwan, the National Archive Library is a random building on the road. You can walk in as long as you want. But if you ever want to visit Singapore's National Archive Library, you need to apply first, and you need to be scanned before you enter the library. And they will, when you apply for visiting National Archive Library, they will ask some kind of question that is very detailed, like why you need to go there, what are you going to read, and where are you going to use this document. So can you say this behavior is kind of a transparenting on national document? Because that is very ambiguous. Because yes, they allow you to read or allow you to use those kind of document, but with some kind of you need to like check all the box to the Singapore government that you are safe, you will not use this document against the Singapore government, something like it. As long as you can check all the boxes, then you can use the document. So they always use this kind of ambiguous policy or ambiguous behavior to and then to say they have the freedom, they are not like China, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And do you have any question to ask, Edward? No? Okay. If you have no further questions, I will invite our final presenter, Willie Smith.
Okay, that's me.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll be presenting on the Philippines today. I was struggling to like kind of come up with like what I wanted to present on, but I think like 2 weeks ago, I had a friend in my MCC class at Chirda, and he said, "Oh, you should do it on the Philippines because that's where I'm from." And I was like, "Okay," and I was like, "What's like a big problem with the Philippines?" And then he said, "A lot of people like to go overseas," and so like I'm going to be talking about like the Philippines, like mass migration for like work overseas, and how it's like a good thing because how they saw it as their plan to increase their economy for the future, but slowly evolved into like a permanent fixture of their economy. So one sec, let me share my screen. Straight off there. Good. Play. Let's see. You see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So this is my presentation, just like the geography of like how Filipino labor is affecting like all of ASEAN and are like around the world. Okay. I guess got to be on this tab. Okay. Okay. So just to begin, like kind of like the origins of like the Philippines. So like pre 1565, which is like when the Spanish showed up to the island. Like the island was only subsistence agriculture, and then their first semblance of like entering the global trade is with something called the galleon trade. So like Spain had a global empire, and so the Philippines was a part of it. And so from Mexico to Manila, Philippines, they would ship all the silver they had from the New World and put it all on ships called galleons, all to the Philippines. And then from the Philippines, they would trade all their silver to specifically China and Japan. The only problem with this trade was that it greatly benefited Spain, but it failed to produce any sort of economic, manufacturing within the Philippines. It made them entirely reliant on the silver like trade and just like rebuilding galleons and making agricultural products. And so it failed to like fully integrate the Philippines into like the global economy by making their own goods. Instead, they were just kind of the middleman in this process. And so for centuries, they kind of trended towards this export dependency all the way until 1898. And 1898 was a big year for the Philippines because that's the year that the Spanish-American War happened, and Spain was a war against the United States, and they ended up losing the war. And so, there were two primary bills that the United States Congress passed that really hampered the Philippines' economic development, which was the Payne-Aldrich tariff and then the Underwood-Simmons tariff. So these two, the first one removed all restrictions on like the Philippines' cash crops tariffs. And so it made them tariff-free to enter the United States from the Philippines. They did the same thing with Hawaii. The only difference is that Hawaii eventually became a state, while for the Philippines, they didn't really see it, the end goal, as making the Philippines a state, because one, they were seen as like other people, and like they didn't want them incorporated into the United States. They saw them as like Filipino Catholics. And then the second reason is that the Philippines was like seen as like too far compared to Hawaii. But I think that's like a stupid reason because like Guam is part of the US still. But anyways, what this did is that these two passages made the Filipino economy basically entirely reliant on agriculture. And so it stunted domestic industrialization all the way through World War II until 1946. And then in 1946, right after the Second World War, the United States decided to leave the Philippines to themselves. But they did a few things before leaving the Philippines, which was one, they did try to do like they did try to spur some sort of economic development through education. And so the main way that the U.S. impacted the Philippines was through its education system, mainly instilling English proficiency and then U.S. cultural awareness as their primary tools while colonizing the island. So that's why even today, the Philippines has some of the highest English proficiency in the world for like in Asia, but they're still held behind because of some reasons I'll discuss later, but mainly corruption and structural issues from the Spanish colonial times. But what this allowed under U.S. colonization is that thousands of Filipinos were able to migrate to the U.S. for work. So that led to 63,000 in Hawaii by 1930 and then 45,000 by 1930 on the mainland. Of course, the U.S. would eventually pass immigration laws that would restrict Filipino immigration, but it still shows that even early on in the 1930s and 40s, they still had some sort of mass migration outside of the country. And so this would set the stage for in the 1960s and 70s when it was government policy to encourage young workers to go abroad. So this is kind of their shift to export-oriented industrialization. So the Philippines became an independent country in 1946, and their initial strategy was import substitution industrialization, or ISI economics. The only problem with ISI is that you put lots of tariffs on your goods, specifically agricultural goods, in order to industrialize fast. But what this led to is that the Philippines, which was basically still an agricultural economy focused on exporting to the United States, this led to their economy basically suffering a lot in the 1950s, especially the U.S. Congress, who, after the Second World War, decided we're going to invest in the Philippines, but we're going to invest mainly in American citizens who lost their properties after the Second World War. And so instead of investing in the Filipino infrastructure, they instead invested in rebuilding American business on the island. So this just led to a further cycle of the elites keep the power, and there still remains like a cycle of it still remains a cycle of a lack of infrastructure on the island. And so in the 1970s, especially with Ferdinand Marcos, who took control of the presidency in 1970, he said, okay, we're going to switch our strategy. We're going to switch to export-oriented industrialization. And so the book speaks about how the Philippines slowly was able to borrow money from the IMF and World Bank and allowed them to build these factories throughout the country and allowed them to export their goods. Only problem with this is that their goods, low-key, were not amazing. This is what the book says. Their products were not as good compared to their neighbors. And so their export-driven growth was super duper slow. And so at the time in the 70s, they had overpopulation, high unemployment, and a stagnant agribusiness, and the state couldn't really grow. And so the only way they saw it, the economy was going to grow, was through radical intervention. And so in 1974, the Philippines had a coup led by Ferdinand Marcos. And so in this coup, one of his big policy plans, economically speaking, was the 1974 labor code. And so this is like the key turning point in the Philippines history where they decided to export their labor across the world. And so Marcos decided to use the surplus of domestic labor, since there were so many workers, especially in and around Manila, which I'll talk a little bit about. There were so many extra workers that Marcos decided, hey, why don't we send them to other countries and they have to return some money to us in the form of remittances. And then we can profit off that and our economy can continue to grow. And then eventually they could come back to the Philippines and work in the Philippines. But they just use this as a temporary stopgap in order to generate more capital in the now. And then later on in the future, when they were more industrialized, they could bring all these workers home. And so in 1974, especially Article 22, it required workers to send back 50 to 70% of earnings back to the state banking system. So if you were a professional, like say like a nurse, it would be 50%. But if you were like a construction worker or some sort of other profession, it would be as high as 70%. You'd have to remit back to your family. And so the Filipino government saw this as a way of making more money, as they would be able to tax their citizens off of these remittances. And then so in 1982, they decided to consolidate everything into the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. There were like a lot of acronyms in this chapter, so I kind of had to skip over a little bit. But essentially, it combined the OEDB, the NSB, and BES into one massive organization where the government, still under martial law at this time, it would be until 1986, but the martial law government in the Philippines decided to consolidate everything into one giant government monopoly and regulate everything. So it's good that it was good in the sense that they were able to combine all of these together, but it was bad because they weren't able to delegate and focus on specific industries, like the National Seaman Board. Today, like 20% of the world's mariners, like on ships, are still Filipino, but they weren't able to like solely focus on maritime traffic and that industry, because they also had to focus on other industries under this one monopoly. Okay. And then basically the state was able to influence everything through this organization. And that was kind of the goal of Marcos when he created this organization. Because at the time, the country was going through a bunch of like rebellions and insurgencies, especially in the south of the country. So he kind of declared martial law in the 70s and enacted his authoritarian policy. And everything he did was to ensure that the government in power would stay in power. And so one of these was creating this agency about employment. And so the state was not receding due to globalization. It was just restructuring its institutions in order to maintain more control. And so they would say that the state would handle marketing, bilateral agreements, and regulation, and then delegates the day-to-day deployment of these workers to private capital. And so they would work with these private capital companies, some of these companies becoming very large and also involving the elites in order to maintain their power. And then they would continue to use these migrant workers, mainly in the 70s and 80s. It was mainly sending Filipino men to the Middle East. But more recently, I'll talk about this later too, it's been more women going abroad, working in household roles. And then, so the government would work with over 1,300 agencies, the majority centered around the Manila area, in order to finance labor and construction contracts to foreign clients. And so, like I said earlier, it was primarily to Japan and the Middle East. Today, it's more so to Japan, the Middle East more so in the past. And then there are over 500 manning agencies for maritime labor. Like I said earlier, the Philippines is one of the hotspots for maritime labor. One of the primary reasons is because they're willing to obviously leave their families, but two is because of their English proficiency. It's one of the languages on the high seas is that you have to be proficient in the English language in order to communicate with other ships. And so Filipinos having really good English skills and also willing to take cheaper contracts, this made this like really attractive for maritime companies. And so they hired Filipinos in droves. And so one of the chapters that the book discussed a lot was Manila specifically. So Manila is really interesting just because of its geography and where it's placed. So Manila's on the North Island of the Philippines, which is called Luzon. And then it's situated right at this bay right here in Manila Bay. The only problem with Manila is that it's really just it's the only city in the Philippines where business is conducted and it's seen as attractive for foreign investors. And even the size of Manila is restricted because of the mountains. It's in a valley on the ocean. And so you really have nowhere else to go outside of Manila. And so the result of this is that a majority of private recruitment firms, I don't know, this must be a typo, but it should be about 70% of private recruitment firms. I must have put down, why did I put down 99? Anyways, it's 70%. The other 30% are in other cities like Cebu and on Mindanao. But 70% are in Manila, and Manila acts as the primate city. It has a population of 15 million within like the urban core, but it's said that it has over like 25 million in the entire metro area, which represents about a fifth of all the Philippines living in a single area. And so all of this, especially when going overseas, when you need passport, visas, documents, it usually flows through the capital, which in this case is Manila. So it just creates a single massive urban bottleneck that all migrant workers have to flow through. And then so within Manila itself, it's mainly focused on these three regions, which is Binondo, Santa Cruz, and Intramuros, which is all in the downtown area where most of the embassies are located, where they need their documents. And so in this, they'll ship, they had a case study in chapter 5, but they focus on a girl named Lisa, and Lisa is from the North Island of Luzon, but closer to like the North Coast, closest to Taiwan. And so what they did is they shipped her by car to Manila. And then in Manila, they gave her, they did like medical tests, training, and then make sure she's like certified for her profession. And so for her profession, she was sent to Japan to work at a nightclub. And so that was like her profession. She was streamlined through the process. And the great thing about Manila is that it has like plenty of reserve labor, and there's plenty of like unemployed people from the countryside who have like lost their jobs due to like natural disasters or just like industrialization in parts of the country, and they don't need as many agricultural workers anymore. And so for companies, this is seen as great because they can show up to Manila and then they don't have a job, and so they'll just be like, hey, do you want to go to Dubai for 3 years and make good money in a sense, and then they'll take the offer. And so for these companies, they really profit off of this industry. And then so they market the English speaking skills and education they received in the Philippines as like their tool in order to go to these countries and be workers. Okay. So like I said, it's a funnel effect. And so all of the migration infrastructure is only centered in a small portion of the country, which is Manila and the Metro Manila area. And so all the government offices to get your passports, visas, all your foreign embassies, like if you need to go to Japan, you probably need like a Japanese visa to go there and work. So you need to go to the Japanese embassy, which is only in Manila. And then medical clinics, unfortunately, a lot of the infrastructure in the Philippines is still lacking. A remnant of the Spanish and American colonial days, but the infrastructure in many parts of the country, especially the South, is lacking a lot. And so medical clinics and most of the hospitals are concentrated in Manila and Cebu and a few other cities in the Philippines. And then international airports, by far the largest international airport is in Manila. And so it just drives everyone into the Manila area. And it causes massive internal migration. And it's not just the workers who are going to Manila, but also families and people looking for domestic jobs. And so it really just leads to a cluster in and around the city. And then a big thing that the book talked about was remittances. And so the original plan of the Marcos government in the 70s and 80s was that these remittances would provide a temporary surplus of cash. And so they would send these foreign currencies straight through government banks, straight back to the families, and the government would take a portion of the money, and it would lead to better welfare for all the people. And so they saw it as export of human labor as like natural for generating more revenue and more taxes for the state, especially with like hard foreign currency that's seen as very valuable. And so in 2006, it was around $13 billion, and that was 9% of the total Filipino GDP. Now it is up to 10%. It was 10.5% when I checked online. And it's more than any traditional, it's one of the highest in the world for remittances, only behind countries that are very poor in Africa or countries in Central America like Mexico, El Salvador, and Honduras. But in terms of percent of its GDP, it's the highest in Asia right now in terms of remittances. So it really makes up a huge percent of their GDP. And so this is kind of the cycle that it came up with. So the book talked about like the economic reality of how migrant workers are deployed. So that starts with foreign employers' demand. So mainly in the 70s and 80s, that was like the Middle East. And so when the Middle East had all this wealth, but not enough workers, they would try and recruit them from abroad. And so the Philippines was one of probably the top destination for the United Arab Emirates, and they wanted to use their oil wealth to grow massively. They would ask the Philippines, especially Filipino companies, hey, we need some workers, especially young men. So how can we get them? They're going to go through these companies. And then the companies would say, okay, we're going to find them and we're going to offer them contracts. And so when they would deploy these migrant workers, they would live in cramped conditions in the Middle East or Japan or wherever, and they would have to send 50 to 70% of their money home. But a lot of people still chose this option because the Philippines did not have the same robust industrialization that other Southeast Asian countries had, like Malaysia or Vietnam. And so they couldn't find domestic jobs. And so their only real option was to go abroad and make money. And after decades of this occurring since the 80s, it's kind of seen as like a coming of age ritual, or even as like just a part of the culture. Is like, oh, you just go abroad for like 3 to 5 years. It's seen as normal now in the Philippines. And so when they send these remittances back to their home, especially if they live in rural areas, it's seen as very important to maintaining their lifestyle. And since the wages they make in these rural communities do not cover everything they need to survive, and so remittances are seen as essential. And then this drives consumption, which then drives more demand, and it creates a loop that the Filipino government has been trying to encourage. And then, so like I discussed, it was only seen as a temporary solution. So in 1974, it was Blas Opal, who at the time was the foreign minister, was the Minister of Labor in the Philippines. And he said, in less than 2 decades, the Philippines will have an economy grown so robust, the program could then self-destruct. But the reality is that never really happened. A few reasons that I'll discuss in a bit, but mainly corruption, that lack of infrastructure and jobs in the Philippines, and then just like the institutionalization of this migrant worker program. And so today, now you have up to 1 million Filipinos who are currently living in 78 countries, expanded from 78. It was originally 78 in 1974, but nowadays it's over 190 countries. So they're literally in every corner of the globe. And so that temporary stopgap never self-destructed. Instead, it became a permanent fixture of the national economy within the Philippines. And so I find it really interesting because even in like my small town, I'm from a small town of 5,000, 6,000 people in Utah. But even in our winters, we need tons of foreign workers for our ski resorts. And so a lot of our ski resorts are almost entirely South Americans or Filipinas. And so I saw it firsthand when I was working at the ski resorts with them. I would see like their experiences and like how they were like going day-to-day life and how they would send money back home. And then so this has been one of the biggest shifts since mainly 2000 is that the migration trends have shifted from predominantly males to predominantly females. And so 1970s, it was mainly construction labor. So that would be in the Middle East or other parts of the world, like in Europe. If they needed more workers, they would hire Philippine men to come and work in those professions. But now 72% of all the contract workers are now women, especially in reproductive care, service labor, and it's concentrated mainly in East Asia, but a large parts of Europe and the United States too, especially California. You're seeing a lot of Filipinos come over and work in these jobs. And so the primary reason is that these East Asian countries are just getting older, their populations are aging, and so they don't have the youthful workers who can take over the childcare jobs. They need these other women to take the more important jobs in the economy. And so they've seen these other jobs go to foreign women. So mainly the predominant demographic is for Filipino women. But also you see Malaysian women, and even in Taiwan, you see like Malaysian women, Indonesian women in these like caregiving roles. And so the Filipino state proactively adapted its export strategy. And so they commodified like their identity on an international scale. And they've slowly shifted their approach to, hey, we're going to export construction workers. They've slowly switched it to, okay, now we're exporting nurses, child givers, nannies. And they've done like a great job of like switching their focus economically, but it's still left them reliant on remittances back home. And so this is discussed in a book in the last chapter, but kind of like the conundrum between like how the state sees this whole migrant export economy versus how people on the ground actually see this migrant export policy. And so the state narrative is that, especially if you're like the oldest child. So in like the example that the book gave, like the girl was like the oldest child. So she was seen as like the sacrificial lamb and like the modern day hero. And so especially in like the patriarchal state, which is Philippines, they discuss like they heroize like the women's sacrifice for national economy and like going abroad, and this narrative like distances the state from the physical peril that they actually endure whilst abroad. But the reality is that like a lot of these migrants are left vulnerable to systematic abuse, exploitation, and total lack of legal protection. That's why, take for example, the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, right? A lot of these workers were left in really bad conditions, and a few of them even died from the conditions to build these massive stadiums in Qatar. A few of them being Filipino workers too, and they were just left to systematic abuse in these countries, and there's not really any way that the Philippine state can enforce their own laws and demand that their workers come home because they're under contract in these countries. And then so there were two cases in the 1990s that the book talked about that almost destroyed the migrant export policy before it even like fully got off the ground. And so the first one was Flor Contemplacion. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but she was a nanny who was living in Singapore, who was executed for killing two other civilians. And of course, just discussed Singapore, but Singapore is very strict in their laws, and any semblance of like going against the state and any justice is going to be taken harshly. And so she was executed in Singapore despite massive protests, and even the Catholic Church. The book said the Catholic Church, the Cardinal of Manila, reached out to the Singapore government asking for, if they could try her instead. And this Singapore government said no. And so this really showed like the limit of like, okay, we can only enforce so much for these migrant workers, but they're still going to be left on their own in these countries. And then the second case in the same year as well, so this caused like a lot of controversy, was Sarah Balabagan. And so for her, she was in the United Arab Emirates when she was in self-defense. She had to kill one of her contract bosses in order to protect herself from being raped herself. And so, but she herself was accused in the crime and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. This was eventually reduced to 2 years, but again, it caused big protests back home, and it showed like, oh, like once we're abroad, like we're just really going to get no protections for defending ourselves. And so a lot of Filipino workers and their families back home are really upset. And so the tragedies sparked massive domestic protests, of course, but it did not ultimately slow down this global deployment machinery. The exports still continued, and they moved past these policies. And then so the book came out in 2010. And so one of the big factors to talk about was like the .com like era and like the rise of the internet. And so a lot of these companies, basically all the companies, switched to digital logistics and web-based recruitment instead of on the ground. And so what this allowed them to do is it allowed them to get rid of a lot of workers and get rid of a lot of advertisement around the country. And instead, they focused solely on the digital realm. And so now, for migrant workers, it's also hugely beneficial because they're able to search through hundreds at a time and then pick the ones that they want to pursue and try and find the highest paying ones in the best paying countries. And so what this also allowed migrant workers to do is that in these foreign countries, they're able to stick closer together, and they're able to like grow a sense of community and maintain some of their Filipino culture as well, because they're able to use the internet to communicate back home with their families. And so it did not merely like accelerate communication, it also was like a mechanism of like migrant survival in these countries. And so it was very important for them to have a sense of like unified identity online. And then, and so the recruiters would use like the global media to gather market intelligence, and then human labor became more dignified. And so for migrant workers, it talked about in the book, it said for migrant workers, they would have to make an account and they would put in these applications to different companies around the world. So, right, like a hotel builds in Hong Kong, or oil rigs in Malaysia, or infrastructure in the Middle East. And so they would put in their applications online and they would see what they would get. And then once they received like word back from these companies, then they could decide to go to these countries or not. And so they would still need to go through Manila ultimately in order to receive like their passports and visas, but it really just dignified it and made the process more streamlined. And so instead of seeing like the internet as like a hamper to this export driven growth, it was seen more as like a catalyst. And so the internet has really fueled this like migrant export growth. And then for like many like cyber communities, they're able to bypass like the state apparatus within the Philippines. And so they're able to basically within these countries, they're just able to maintain global relations and just like maintain their sense of identity whilst abroad. And so they're able to like not be as isolated in these countries and still maintain like relations back home. And yeah, I mean, this last chapter in the book was a bit of a dull, but it just discussed mainly the internet and online. But yeah, and that's my presentation on Filipino export migrants.
Okay, thank you very much. Please give us amazing about the migrant workers of Philippines. So actually, I not familiar about this topic,
Yeah.
but I just want to ask a personal question. How about if a Filipino migrant work as United States? Who or she or he can stay? How many years can stay as? What's the visa of the just like migrant worker?
think it's
Especially for
J1.
this moment, do you think the President Donald Trump welcome those just like migrant worker, just like Filipino?
Yeah. So I think like yes, there has been some backlash like immigration in the US, but I don't think it's gonna change because one, like the US is aging, especially in like large parts of the country. And so especially for like Filipina nurses or caregivers are gonna be needed, especially in California, like that number is not slowing down. I think President Trump is more focusing on like the legal immigration and like green card holders. Like there was a recent policy in the news where Trump wanted to change how to like renew your green cards, and so it said like you had to like the news article said like you had to like return to your home country. Like that's what people thought. Like you had to return to your home country and then apply for renewal for a green card, but that's not true. It was mainly just like the time frame for renewing is like sped up now, so you need to like renew it more often. But I don't think like it's going to change like in terms of this like export migrants. I still think it's going to be a big one. And the visa I'm like 90% sure is J1 visa, and it's like usually 2 to 5 years depending on your profession.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then I forgot to mention, I must have forgot to put it in the slides, but like because like the US like because of the US intervention in the Philippines, it led to the US cooperating with like a lot of elites in order to control the country and the economy. But these elites like still hold the power in the Philippines. And so that's mainly like Marcos, and then Marcos' son is now the president nowadays. And then one of the first presidents who like wasn't from the elites was like one of the recent ones. It was Rodrigo Duterte. And so yeah, but he was like still involved with the elites in a way, and now his daughter is actually vice president of the country. And so now it just shows like it's just like trickling down. And so a lot of people are disillusioned with Filipino politics right now. It's very I asked my friend about it. He said it's very controversial.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you
Question.
have any questions? Anything about Philippines? Okay, anything.
What are like some of the most desirable destinations for Filipino people? Like if they can choose, like where do they want to go?
Yeah. So the Middle East kind of got a bad reputation when these workers came back from the Middle East, you know, they always said it was like the conditions were very crammed, and it was consistently like they were mistreated, a lot of woodworkers. And so um, a lot of the workers like desired destinations is obviously like the United States, just because there's like a large Filipino population there already, and so it requires like a little bit less effort in order to integrate, and they have more of like a social apparatus to like go through in order to integrate successfully. And then also Japan is viewed very highly just because the contracts there are more beneficial, and Japan is just overall a safer country, and so they would fear less for their overall safety if they took some profession. Like unfortunately for like many Filipinos going abroad, like a big industry is like the sex industry, and so that's seen as like more safe in Japan versus like if you went to the sex industry in like the Middle East for them.
If you ever have the chance when you're in Asia, I recommend you go to Hong Kong on a Sunday afternoon.
Yes.
Hong
Yes.
Kong.
On a Sunday afternoon, if you want to see Filipino overseas workers in action, if you go to Hong Kong on a Sunday afternoon, you will not believe what you're seeing.
I'm sure it's just little Manila there.
Well, you have to go on Sunday though, because Sunday is the only day that they have off from work.
Yeah.
And so they basically don't have anywhere to go. So they basically just meet in the street and bring tents and play cards and drink alcohol. And you will see thousands of Filipinos on the street every single Sunday in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Guess I gotta go check it out.
How about Taipei? How about Taipei? Where do you know the gathering place of Filipino at Sunday morning at Taipei?
No, I don't. Where?
North Slope of Zhongshan, Zhongshan Beilu.
Oh, okay.
Oh, nice.
I don't live over there, so I don't know.
Oh wait, yeah, I've been to a few Filipino restaurants over there. Yeah,
Yes.
it seems like they're clustered over there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can see the migrant from Indonesia as main station of Taipei, Taipei main station.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah,
do
I
you?
think I think it's interesting because I don't know, this is my personal opinion, but I don't think the Filipinos are like treated as well in Asia as they are in the United States.
Yes.
And like Taiwan or Japan, I have the feeling like they are treated like a second-class citizen, just like a artsangongming, like this kind of, yeah.
Yes.
But in America, it don't feel like that as much. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's just for like a lot of immigrant groups in general in the US, just because like there's like immigrants from like or permanent residents in the US or like naturalized citizens from like every country in the world. And so naturally like there's gonna be less prejudice, and it's really unfortunate like in MTC classes like that I was taking, like there's obviously like a lot of Indonesians and a lot of Viets, a lot of Filipinos, and yeah, they are viewed like in a lesser sense, which is really unfortunate because I think they're like really hardworking people.
Yeah, that's why I think it's funny when people in China or Taiwan will try to talk to me about the racial issues in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm like, come on.
Come on, bro. Yeah. I think I forgot to mention this is my presentation, but there's like a lot of it's called like marriage migration. So like a lot of, especially since like mostly like Filipinos are going abroad, a lot of them tend to marry like foreign spouses. And so but like one of the policies is like you can't get married when you're under contract. You can't have children either. So when they get like pregnant or like they get married, they immediately have to leave their job. And then after this contract job, like it's usually up to their spouse to provide. So a lot of these like female spouses don't have like any network to like get a job, especially if they move to like the United States. Like they're really like dependent on their spouse.
Yes, when I ask you a personal question, could I say the Philippine military or Philippine, no matter Air Force, Navy or Army, can describe they are pro-American?
Mhm.
Military,
Yeah.
just military, no matter what kind of government, just military. Can
Yeah.
I say they are pro-American? Could I say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think Philippines is pretty pro-American. And part of that even has to do just like even on a more deeper level tied to religion, right? I mean, Philippines is a very Catholic Christian country, and the United States is a very Catholic Christian nation. So I think a lot of people feel a connection to America just because of that. That's one of the things to me that makes Philippines very different than the other countries in Southeast Asia. There's not really any country, at least I don't think, that is nearly has such a large percentage of the population that is Catholic.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then I think because of language, they have a strong cultural tie to the United States.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think for me, I would say Philippines is pro-American.
Yes.
I think right now they have some trouble with Donald Trump, but that is not going to last forever. So
Yes.
yeah,
I think
that's my take. I think they're pro-American.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I agree. They're definitely pro-American. It's kind of like it's kind of the relationship where like kind of like Japan like colonized Taiwan, but like Taiwan still kind of looks a little fondly on Japan nowadays. It's kind of like that with Philippines and America. Like we took over the Philippines, like did some nasty stuff, but ultimately like they still like felt like they benefited a little bit, I guess. And so they still have like, I don't know, they want to maintain good relations with us, especially their Navy. Yeah.
How about your personal feeling about the negotiation between Japan and the Philippines to the elimination of EEZ from United Navy?
I saw that. That was like recently in the news. But like it's good. It definitely shows like some cooperation because like even today, like the Philippines can't get along with, China, even Taiwan a little bit, Vietnam, they still don't agree on EEZ. But it's good that like these US allies in the region are working together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, do you have any further question about Philippines?
No, I don't have any other question. I think it's great. I learned a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
I'm also learn a lot from everyone. So next week is our final week. And actually, we just want to make a recap with this class. Maybe next week we can from 10 a.m. to 12. Okay, so just a party time, just a party time. And if we
Next week will be in person or online?
just in class in our
In Shida.
yes in
Okay.
Shida. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we were back to Shida. Okay.
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 Great.
Thank you, everyone. If
Yes.
you have no further question, we will stop here.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Your cooperation for me.
No problem.
My
Thank
personal
you. See
reason.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
See
Thank
you
you,
next
Professor.
week. See you next
We'll see you
week.
next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.